One insult, 2 seconds of silence, and then a call from a 74-year-old tutor that shut down a live television studio. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't expected, but when Jasmine Crockett mocked J.D. Vance for failing the second grade, she never imagined a voice from the Appalachian Hills would dial in and deliver a truth that left an entire room breathless. Not angry, not loud, just still. Because sometimes the sharpest answers don't come from politicians or pundits. They come from those who remember what the world forgot to honor. Now, before we begin, just one thing. What you're about to hear didn't happen exactly this way, but the story is built on echoes of real people, real pain, and the kinds of reckonings that never make headlines, but shape who we become. It's a dramatization, yes, but one rooted in emotions too honest to ignore. And in a time when shouting fills every screen, this is a story about the power of remembering and what happens when silence speaks louder than pride. Let's begin. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The studio was colder than it looked, not because of the lights, those burned hot overhead, but because everyone in the room knew this wasn't just another panel. It was politics with teeth. CNN had billed it as America at a crossroads, policy, power, and the people. But everyone watching understood what it really was, a showdown. J.D. Vance sat at the far end of the semicircular table, shoulders relaxed, expression unreadable. He wasn't a man who courted the spotlight, at least not in the way his opponents did. But tonight, the spotlight was already stalking him. 2 seats down, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, eyes locked on him like a marksman setting sights. She didn't come to discuss policy. She came for blood. "Let me get this straight," she began, voice steady, smile thin. "We're supposed to trust the future of this country to someone who failed second grade?" The words didn't echo. They detonated. Laughter erupted from part of the crowd. Some viewers at home probably chuckled too. There's always a segment of America that enjoys the gladiator arena until someone bleeds. J.D. didn't flinch. Not a twitch in the jaw, not a blink, just a slight tilt of the head, as if he were absorbing, not dodging, the blow. The moderator looked down awkwardly at her notepad. One of the producers winced behind the glass. But Crockett wasn't finished. "I mean, come on," she added, gesturing with a dismissive hand. "We're talking about leading economic reform, negotiating military contracts, standing toe-to-toe with global powers, and this man couldn't even pass a spelling quiz at age 8. More laughter, some genuine, some uncomfortable. J.D. turned slightly toward her, then not with aggression, but with the cool restraint of someone who had been here before. Maybe not in this exact moment, but in 1,000 other rooms that felt just like it. Rooms where people measured your worth by the wrong ruler. He cleared his throat, leaned in just an inch, and said calmly, "You know, I think I'll let someone else answer that one." That was it. No defense, no counterattack, no headline-worthy comeback. Just a sentence. Flat, controlled, mysterious. For a few seconds, the room didn't know what to do with that. The audience, cameras, panelists, they all hesitated, waiting for the punchline that never came. Crockett blinked. The moderator tried to recover the thread, pivoting to healthcare policy, but the moment lingered like smoke after a fire. On social media, the clip was already being clipped and shared. Crockett flames Vance for failing second grade. Senator Vance stares down insult. But something was off. Beneath the surface, people were unsettled. They expected fireworks. What they got was silence. And silence made them curious. Who was this man who didn't flinch? Why didn't he fight back? And what did he mean by letting someone else answer? The show rolled on. Talking points flew. Charts were shown. Interruptions sparked between other panelists. But in the minds of millions of viewers across the country, one moment replayed over and over again. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. And somewhere, in a quiet corner of Appalachia, an elderly woman sat forward in her recliner, turned up the volume on her TV, and whispered under her breath, "It's time." The silence hadn't ended. It had only shifted. The host, a seasoned anchor who had moderated a dozen of these segments before, cleared her throat and glanced nervously at her notes. Her eyes darted to the control room behind the glass, as if someone there might hand her the next move. Nothing came. "Well," she said, voice rising slightly in pitch, "let's bring it back to infrastructure." "No!" J.D. Vance's voice interrupted softly but unmistakably, like the click of a latch unlocking a door. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even raising his voice. But the tone carried enough gravity to slow the air around him. He looked toward the host, then toward Crockett. His eyes weren't sharp but steady, as if speaking not to her, but to something behind her words. "I'll let someone else answer that," he said again, more slowly this time. "Someone who remembers." The sentence didn't land the way Crockett had hoped. There was no stammer, no flash of embarrassment, no retreat. Just that line, curious, calm, and strangely unfinished. "Someone who remembers," the host repeated, blinking. J.D. didn't elaborate. He simply folded his hands in front of him and looked down at the table, as though the conversation had become a private matter only he could hear. His silence was no longer passive. It was charged, directed, measured. A ripple ran through the room. Even Crockett shifted in her seat, unsure whether to laugh again, to press further, or to wait. The host regrouped, trying to smooth the moment over. "Okay then, let's pivot to budgetary priorities. Representative Crockett, you've spoken previously about reallocating federal resources, but the energy had changed. The air had been cut with a dull blade, and now it hung oddly still. Behind the cameras, a producer made a subtle rapid gesture. Another checked social media feeds, already buzzing from JD's cryptic reply. One trending caption read, "JD Vance drops mystery line on live TV. Who's he talking about?" The panel rolled on. Talking points resumed. Stats were cited, traded, refuted. Crockett found her footing again, slamming corporate tax shelters and championing education reform. JD nodded along, interjected once or twice, but the gravity of the moment had already drifted past them, floating behind the conversation like a lost satellite signal. What did he mean? Someone who remembers. Was it a speechwriter? A political mentor? A family member? Some ghost of the past ready to appear in Act 2? Viewers didn't know, but they wanted to, and that, more than anything, kept them from turning the channel. Somewhere in rural Ohio, the television in a modest living room remained on. The woman in the recliner, her hair snow-white and her voice worn thin by time, didn't change the channel either. She sat forward, one hand resting on the arm of the chair, the other clutching the remote like a question she wasn't ready to ask aloud. She knew that voice. She remembered that boy. And if no one else was going to say it, maybe, just maybe, it was time she did. The segment was supposed to be winding down. The final block, 5 minutes of audience call-ins before credits rolled, and the post-panel analyst took over. Producers liked it for the unpredictability. A voter from Kansas might ask about immigration. A retired teacher from Nevada might push back on federal testing mandates. It added flavor. But tonight, something different was coming. The host smiled into camera 2. "And now we go to our first caller. You're on the air." A pause, a rustle of static, then a voice, software Southern and old. "Hello there. My name's Cora Mae Dunley. I reckon I don't have a fancy title, but I got something I think needs saying." The studio froze. J.D. Vance's eyes didn't move, but something in his chest tightened, just slightly. He knew that voice. He hadn't heard it in years, but memory doesn't let go of things like that, especially when it's the voice that first taught you how to hold a pencil right, or how to read the difference between there and there. Cora continued, her Appalachian drawl cutting through the polished panel like a hymn at a courtroom. "I've been watching tonight, and I heard what that young lady said about J.D. failing the second grade." Crockett shifted in her seat. She wasn't smiling anymore. "I reckon most folks hear that and think it means he wasn't smart, or that he didn't try hard enough. But I figure if y'all are going to talk about a man's childhood on national TV, you ought to know the whole of it." The host tried to interject. "Ma'am, we're almost out of—" But Cora spoke right through it, not loud, but unstoppable. "See, I was JD's tutor back then. He didn't fail because he didn't know things. He failed because he was feeding his granddaddy before school, because his mama was sick and gone half the time, and that little boy had to be the grown-up in a house with no heat. Silence, on set, online, in millions of homes. I taught that boy how to read from cereal boxes and tractor ad because that's what we had. And I watched him show up every night after he put his granddaddy to bed just to learn the difference between justice and just us. And I'll tell you something else. He passed my test every single time. JD looked down. His hands folded neatly in his lap, trembled just once. Cora's voice softened. Some of us come from places where passing second grade ain't the biggest challenge in your life. Survival is. Dignity is. Not quitting when the world calls you trash is. The host was speechless. The control room didn't know whether to cut or stay. Crockett stared at the desk, saying nothing. Not because she agreed, but because in that moment, there was no position to take. There was only the weight of a voice that remembered when nobody else had cared to. Then Cora said one last thing. I don't know what you call a man who comes from that and ends up here, but I know what I call him. A beat, a miracle with boots on. And with that, the line went dead. No music, no transition, just air, heavy and still. Somewhere in Tennessee, a viewer muted their TV. In Michigan, a former steelworker wiped his eye. And in the studio, for the first time that night, even the cameras seemed unsure where to look. What just happened wasn't politics, it wasn't strategy, it was truth. Unpolished, undeniable. And it had just changed the entire conversation. The network didn't replay the call. Not that night, but they didn't have to. Within hours, Cora Mae Dunley's voice had been clipped, subtitled, and passed through every corner of the internet. Conservative talk radio ran it in full. A progressive podcast labeled it the most devastating 2 minutes on live television this year. Even late-night comedians, usually quick with mockery, played the audio and said nothing. And somewhere, far from the noise, Cora sat at her kitchen table in southeastern Ohio, clutching a chipped coffee mug with both hands. She didn't own a Twitter account. She didn't want one. She'd only called because something inside her had said, enough. She didn't recognize the man on screen at first. His suits were sharp now, his voice measured, but then he'd turned his head slightly, just enough for her to see the boy beneath the senator, and it all came back. She had met JD when he was 8. He was always a little late for their sessions. Not disrespectful, just stretched thin. He'd slide into the chair across from her, hands too cold for spring, shoes too big and scuffed like they'd belonged to someone else before him, and maybe they had. Sorry, Miss Dunley, he'd mumble, trying to catch his breath. Granddaddy fell asleep in his chair again. Took me a minute to get the stove off. Most boys his age worried about lunch boxes and math drills. JD worried about whether the gas had been shut off before they ran out of quarters for the meter. He didn't have his own backpack, just a torn plastic grocery sack where he kept his notebooks and a pencil, so worn down she once replaced it with 3 new ones, and found he kept using the stub anyway. When she asked why, he shrugged and said, feels like mine. Cora had tutored plenty of children in her 42 years at the school. Some were bright, some needed a little extra help, some just needed someone to sit still and believe they weren't hopeless. JD was different. He wasn't behind. He was carrying too much. I remember that look in his eyes, she would later tell a local reporter. Not the kind of lost you see in a child who doesn't understand the lesson. The kind that comes from understanding too much too early. She never said it aloud at the time, but she worried about him. Not because he lacked ability, but because the world he lived in never seemed to give him room to be a child. Still, he showed up. Every week, JD would return, cereal box in hand. Not to eat. It was his reading homework. Together, they would sit at that little table behind the library wall and sound out words from Raisin Bran and Frosted Flakes. He'd underline words like nourish and strong and ask what they meant in a sentence, and she would answer, always the same way. They mean you keep going, baby. Now, decades later, she watched that boy sit still on national television as the world questioned his worth. And she realized something. He wasn't quiet because he had no defense. He was quiet because, once again, he was carrying something too big to explain in a soundbite. But maybe now, he didn't have to carry it alone. The wind had a bite to it that morning, not the kind of winter breeze that nipped at your cheeks and made you zip your coat higher, but the kind that found the holes in everything, in threadbare gloves, in broken zippers, in soles coming loose at the toe, and JD's shoes had all three. He walked carefully, pressing his heels down first to avoid feeling the icy slush seeping in. A grocery bag swung at his side. Inside were 2 peanut butter sandwiches, 1 hard-boiled egg, and a crumpled napkin with his grandfather's handwriting. Be kind. That's the only test that matters. The second sandwich wasn't for him. He crossed the schoolyard just as the bell rang, heart pounding not because he was late, he often was, but because he knew what he was about to do would get him in trouble. Inside, his friend Marcus sat hunched at the back of the classroom. JD had noticed for weeks that Marcus never unpacked lunch, never waited in the cafeteria line. He just folded his arms and watched the clock. So that morning, JD slipped the sandwich under Marcus's desk, gave him a small nod, and said nothing. The teacher noticed. "Mr. Vance," she called sharply, "what exactly are you doing?" JD froze. Marcus tried to hide the sandwich behind his math book, but it was too late. The teacher walked over, plucked the sandwich off the desk like it was contraband, and held it aloft. "We do not share food in class. You know the rules." JD opened his mouth to explain, but the words caught in his throat. He knew better. His stomach nodded. "Detention," she said, "and I'll be calling home." He didn't cry. Not then. He simply nodded, took his seat, and waited for the bell to ring. From the hallway window, Cora Mae Dunley had seen it all. She wasn't supposed to be there yet. Her tutoring sessions didn't begin until the afternoon, but she'd arrived early to sort donated books. When she saw JD pass the sandwich, she paused, and when she saw the teacher pull it away and write his name down, her heart sank. That evening, Cora asked the librarian for JD's file. She didn't find much. A few notes about tardiness, missed homework, nothing about his home life, nothing about his grandfather, who used oxygen at night, nothing about the gas station JD passed each morning to check for coins around the air pump, nothing about the boy who walked on torn soles so someone else wouldn't go hungry. She waited until JD's session the next day. Instead of worksheets, she brought in a stack of cereal boxes and newspapers. He looked at them, confused. "Ain't that trash?" "No," she smiled gently. "It's what you got, and we're going to make it work." That day, they read the back of a Raisin Bran box. He circled the word fortified and asked what it meant. She explained. He nodded, then underlined it twice. From then on, she built every lesson from what JD already touched. Packaging, signs, receipts. Nothing wasted. Nothing beyond him. And slowly, the boy who sat with his hands buried in his coat sleeves began to sit taller. He never brought up the detention again. Neither did she. But before he left that day, he placed a sandwich on her desk. Half peanut butter, half hope. Cora didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words floated through the studio monitors, through homes in Cincinnati and Tuscaloosa and Sacramento, through car radios and kitchen speakers, and smartphones held by calloused hands. They were plain words, softly spoken, but they carried weight, the kind that settled in the bones. "That boy didn't fail second grade," she said gently. "He was surviving it." In the control room, a producer froze mid-sentence. She replayed the line in her headset. 1 second of silence passed, then another. Then someone leaned forward and whispered, "Keep her on." On screen, JD Vance didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the desk in front of him, but his hand had curled into a quiet fist. Crockett, seated across from him, leaned back. Her lips parted slightly as if to interrupt, but no sound came. Cora kept going. "I remember one evening," she said, "I had come by with a few hand-me-down books from a teacher upstate. I knocked on the screen door, and JD answered. Hair messy, socks mismatched, smell of burnt toast in the air." She paused. "He was 8 years old, and he was cooking." JD's head bowed slightly. Cora's voice remained steady, but the memory cracked at the edges. "I asked if his granddaddy was home, and he nodded toward the living room. There was an oxygen tank humming next to a recliner. JD had propped up a book on the armrest. Old Yeller, I think. Said he was reading it to him before dinner. She chuckled softly. He burned the grilled cheese that night, black as coal. He was so embarrassed, but I didn't care. I sat there on that wobbly kitchen chair and ate every bite like it was filet mignon. Because that child, he wasn't just feeding his grandfather, he was teaching him how to dream again. Across the country, eyes began to shift. Viewers who had laughed earlier were now still. The kind of still that lives between heartbeats. In Tennessee, a retired nurse reached for her tissue box. In Minnesota, a teacher paused her grading and turned up the volume. In the studio, the energy had changed. There were no retorts, no talking points, just the sound of one woman remembering. After he cleaned up the plates, he pulled out one of those cereal boxes we'd been using. Cora continued, lit a candle, because the power had gone out again, and started practicing the words we'd circled. 8 years old, she repeated almost to herself. Cooking, nursing, reading by candlelight. Cora's voice dropped. Some kids don't get to be kids. Some don't get tutors or extra help or second chances. They get bills, oxygen tanks, and the weight of a house falling apart around them. She took a breath. The line crackled, then cleared. So no, JD didn't fail that grade. But I dare say the grade failed him, and so did we. In the studio, the host looked down, her script forgotten. Jasmine Crockett's posture shifted. Her hands, once animated and bold, now rested quietly in her lap. Her gaze softened, not in defeat, but in recognition of something that reached deeper than politics. JD finally looked up, not at anyone in particular, but into the space where Cora's voice had been. He didn't smile, he didn't speak, but something in his eyes had changed, like a curtain drawn back, not to reveal weakness, but a different kind of strength. And through 1,000 TV screens across the country, viewers leaned in, not to judge, not to pity, but to understand. Because now they knew, you can't grade someone's courage. And sometimes the hardest lessons come long before the classroom bell ever rings. It didn't take long. By the time the studio lights dimmed and the closing credits rolled, the internet had already begun to move. Not in a wave, but a current. Quiet at first, then stronger, then impossible to ignore. The clip was just over 2 minutes long, poorly compressed at first, pulled from a viewer's recording of the live broadcast. But that didn't matter. The moment was raw, and raw travels faster than polish. J.D. Vance's childhood tutor silences Congresswoman Crockett. Live. The headline raced through YouTube like a lightning strike. Within an hour, the video had been re-uploaded dozens of times under slightly different names. The call that stopped the room, Cora May versus Congress. The truth no one expected. She knew the boy, and she shut them all down. Each version had thousands, then tens of thousands of views. By morning, one had crossed 500,000. On Facebook, the clip was shared by veterans groups, PTA mothers, and former students of rural schools who had long since left those dusty towns, but still carried their echoes. One share read, I taught in West Virginia for 20 years. I know that voice. I've heard that story in every hallway no one reports from. Reddit caught it next. The top comment on r/politics. That wasn't a call-in. That was an intervention. On R Appalachia. We know Cora May. We all had a Cora May. She didn't just speak for JD, she spoke for us. But the biggest surprise wasn't who posted the clip. It was who didn't. Major media outlets tiptoed around it at first. There was hesitation in how to cover a story that wasn't about legislation or scandal, but about an old woman's trembling voice and a child's torn shoes. But users filled the gap. They dubbed her America's Quiet Witness. Memes appeared with Cora's quote, he didn't fail, he was surviving, superimposed over black and white images of school children, soup kitchens, and Appalachian hills. And JD? He said nothing. His team issued no statement, no press release, no spin, just silence, again, which made the public lean in further. Who was this man, really? They dug deeper. Forums unearthed old interviews where JD had briefly mentioned his grandfather's oxygen tank, his mother's addiction, his first reading lessons with cereal boxes. Nobody had connected those breadcrumbs before. Now they lined up like a breadcrumb trail back to something honest, something unpolished, something missing from most political profiles. Late-night shows debated the moment. One host said, "I don't know what was more surprising, that someone called in or that they didn't yell." Another simply replayed Cora's final words, "A miracle with boots on," and said, "I'll be honest, that's the best political commentary I've heard in 10 years. But perhaps the truest response came from a short tweet. Just 7 words, no hashtags, no emojis. "I wasn't ready to feel that much." And beneath that, replies poured in. "Same." That call stayed with me. "My dad cried, first time since '93. It wasn't that people had suddenly switched sides or become JD supporters overnight. It was something subtler. A man had been turned into a punchline. And then, because of a voice that remembered, he became something more. The tide hadn't just turned, it had deepened. And across every screen and scroll, the question hung unspoken. What else had we been wrong about? By morning, Jasmine Crockett's team had crafted a statement. It was tight, tested, and on brand. Released first through her official X account, formerly Twitter, then picked up by sympathetic news outlets. It read in part, "Let's not confuse sentimentality with substance. Emotional manipulation shouldn't replace accountability. We need serious leaders, not nostalgia." The subtext was clear. The moment with JD's Tutor, now replayed over 9 million times, was being framed as calculated, more theater than truth. But the reply section told another story. One user, a retired coal miner from West Virginia, wrote, "If that was acting, then give her an Oscar, because she played my mama, my sister, and half the holler I grew up in." Another replied simply, "I was JD once." It was reposted over 18,000 times. Crockett's comment sparked headlines, just not the ones her team had hoped for. Congresswoman doubles down after viral moment backfires. Emotion versus empathy. Did Jasmine go too far? The Tutor America didn't know it needed. On local radio shows, callers flooded in. A trucker in Indiana broke down on air, saying he hadn't thought about the woman who taught him to read after his father left until he heard Cora's voice. A single mom in Oklahoma called her daughter's school and asked if there was a Cora May there, and if so, could she bake something for her this week? Veterans groups, normally fragmented across party lines, found rare common ground in the moment. One viral post from a retired Army sergeant read, "You don't measure a man by what grade he passed. You measure him by who he never gave up on." JD didn't quit on his grandpa. He didn't quit on that tutor. That's more than I can say for a lot of people in Washington. A former dropout turned community college teacher in Kentucky posted a thread that quickly went national. "I failed 8th grade. I also held my mother's hand through chemotherapy and worked nights at a gas station to cover rent. When I see JD, I don't see a politician. I see the kid they always underestimated, until he made it impossible to ignore him." Meanwhile, JD stayed quiet. No interviews, no statements, no camera-ready walkbacks or follow-ups. Just stillness. His silence was no longer strategic. It was magnetic. People projected into it what they needed to see. Strength, humility, grace, maybe even guilt. But whatever it was, it felt real. And Crockett, usually quick on her feet, suddenly looked flat by comparison. Her words, once crisp and cutting, now felt like they belonged to someone trying to edit a story mid-sentence, after the reader had already cried at the ending. Her next public appearance was a town hall in Atlanta. She tried to pivot back to policy, but the crowd felt cooler, more skeptical. One elderly woman asked about funding for rural tutors. Another asked whether Crockett had ever missed a meal as a child. And in a coffee shop 2 blocks away, a man wearing a faded U.S. Navy ball cap turned to his wife and said, "Funny, ain't it? A lady with no microphone just said more than half the people who got paid to talk last night." She nodded. And somehow, I believed her. The story was no longer about a failed grade. It was about a country remembering how easily it forgets. And the more Crockett pushed back, the more people leaned toward the woman who hadn't raised her voice. Only her memory. 3 days passed before JD said anything. Cable networks ran the clip of Cora May's call on loop. Panelists speculated on whether it was part of a calculated rollout, a happy accident, or something more human than strategy allowed. Talk shows dissected Crockett's misstep. Hashtags like hashtag raised by Cora and hashtag surviving his passing had trended for 72 hours straight. And still, J.D. Vance said nothing. Until Thursday night. No big podium, no stage rally. Just a pre-taped sit-down interview in a small wood-paneled studio in Columbus, Ohio. The host was a local name, respected, not flashy. The setting felt more like a family room than a set. There was no live audience, no applause. Just 2 chairs, 1 lamp, and the kind of lighting that doesn't try to flatter, only reveal. The interviewer opened gently. "Senator Vance, why haven't you responded until now?" JD didn't blink. He didn't reach for a practiced smile. He took a breath, then spoke. "Because sometimes silence is strength," he said, "but not when someone else remembers for you." The room felt still, as if even the camera had paused to listen more closely. "I've been a lot of things," he continued. "Marine, author, senator. But before all that, I was a boy who read cereal boxes at a kitchen table with a woman named Cora Mae Dunley. And when she spoke, I didn't feel exposed. I felt seen." The interviewer leaned forward. "Did you know she was going to call?" JD shook his head. "No, I hadn't spoken to her in years. I didn't even know she was still watching. But the minute she started talking," he smiled faintly, "I was 8 years old again, holding a pencil with a cracked eraser, trying not to spell tomorrow with 3 R's. They both chuckled, gently, the kind of laugh that belongs to people who've lived through enough to appreciate where it all began. The host shifted tones. "Congresswoman Crockett called the moment emotional manipulation. Others say you let someone else speak for your past to avoid accountability. What do you say to that?" JD nodded slowly, not defensive. "I say this. There are places in America where survival looks a lot like failure, on paper. And sometimes the people who come from those places don't get to tell their stories in real time. They have to wait, for breath, for space, for someone to believe it's worth listening to." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small, worn piece of folded paper, yellowed at the edges, creased like it had been opened and closed more times than it was ever written on. "I found this the night after that panel," JD said, holding it carefully. "I hadn't seen it in 20 years. He unfolded it. The camera zoomed slowly, not enough to read every word, but enough to see the scrawl of a child's handwriting. "It's from a writing assignment Cora gave me when I was 8, he said. "She asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up." He read aloud. "One day I'll protect people like you, Grandma." His voice didn't crack, but his pause said enough. He folded the paper again, slower this time. "I don't always get it right," he added, "but I never forgot the reason I stood up in the first place." The interview ended without applause. No fanfare. Just a quiet fade to black and a title card that read, "Surviving is Passing, a Conversation with J.D. Vance." And in thousands of homes that night, viewers sat longer than they usually did after a segment ended. Some didn't move, some wiped their eyes, some called their own grandmothers. Because in a world where politicians yell to be heard, one man had whispered something truer. It happened on a Thursday. Snow still clung to the corners of the playground, half melted and stained with grit, the kind that turned white into a tired gray. JD sat at the back of the classroom, his lunch wrapped neatly in a brown paper bag with his name written in blue ink across the front. His grandfather's handwriting, careful and slanted. He hadn't eaten yet. He was waiting for the bell to ring so he could slip outside and find Marcus behind the gym. Marcus never brought lunch, never asked anyone for food. He just watched the others eat, jaw tight, hands buried in his coat pockets, like he was trying to hold something in. JD didn't say anything to anyone, just got up quietly, walked outside before the cafeteria monitor noticed, and handed Marcus half a sandwich, wrapped in foil. 1/2 peanut butter, 1/2 jelly. "You don't gotta say nothing," JD muttered. "Just eat it." He turned to go back inside. He almost made it, but Mrs. Fallon, the assistant principal, stood at the edge of the doorway, clipboard in hand, frown already forming. "Jonathan Vance," she called, "come with me." They sat him down in the front office. It smelled like floor wax and pencil shavings. The heat hissed through old metal vents, but JD's fingers were still cold. "Why were you outside without permission?" she asked. "And why are you distributing food that's not yours to give?" He tried to explain, not to plead, just to lay it out straight. "He don't bring food, ma'am. I had extra." She didn't nod, didn't write anything down. She simply said, "Rules are rules. You're suspended for the rest of the day. We'll be calling home." JD's throat burned. He didn't speak. He just sat there, legs swinging slightly above the floor, until someone handed him his coat and pointed to the exit. He walked the mile home alone. The cold didn't bother him at first. He was too busy trying to figure out what to say to his grandfather. What words would cover the shame? The truth would only make it worse. Not because his grandfather would be mad, but because he wouldn't. And that was worse. The disappointment in that man's quiet eyes always felt heavier than any punishment. So he rehearsed a lie. By the time he reached the porch, his shoes soaked through and a small rip in his glove growing wider, he had the story ready. "Hey," his grandfather called from inside. "You're early." "Yeah," JD said, forcing a sniffle. "Slipped on the ice. Teacher said I should go home and rest." There was a pause. JD waited for a follow-up question. None came. Instead, a rustle of blankets, the wheeze of the oxygen tank. "You hurt?" JD shook his head, even though his grandfather couldn't see him. "No, sir." "All right then," the voice answered softly. "Go warm up. You want a cup of soup?" JD nodded. "Yes, please." And that was that. He stood in the kitchen, holding the warm mug two-handed, steam curling into his face. The lie settled in his stomach, thick and quiet. Later that night, he pulled out the foil from his pocket, half a sandwich still untouched. He placed it on the counter, next to a crumpled napkin with the same handwriting as the lunch bag. "Be kind. That's the only test that matters." He didn't fail the school's rulebook. He passed something else. They just didn't grade for it. That evening, just after dinner, a knock came at the door. JD's grandfather was already asleep in his recliner, the hiss of his oxygen tank steady and low. The television played a muted rerun of a game show no one was really watching. JD, curled up near the space heater with a library book missing half its back cover, froze. The knock came again, light but firm. He opened the door to find Cora Mae Dunley standing there with a satchel over one shoulder and a large plastic flashlight in her hand. Her coat looked too thin for the cold, and her boots carried flecks of frozen mud. She smiled like someone who didn't believe in unannounced visits, but had made one anyway. "Didn't mean to interrupt," she said, "but I figured you might have some reading time this evening." JD blinked. Yeah, I guess." "Good," she replied. "Then let's get started." She stepped in without waiting for an invitation, her boots squeaking softly against the linoleum floor. From her satchel, she pulled out a book, Charlotte's Web, its spine worn down, the cover taped on one corner. "This one's got more truth in it than half the textbooks I've seen," she said, placing it gently on the table. "You ever met a spider who writes?" JD shook his head. "Well, you're about to." He hesitated. "Ain't you supposed to be mad? About earlier?" She stopped unpacking for a moment, looked straight at him. "You got punished for sharing your lunch with someone who needed it," she said. "If I got mad about that, I'd have to question every lesson I ever taught." JD glanced at the book, then at her. "I got suspended." She nodded slowly. "Sometimes the wrong people get punished for the right things. That doesn't mean you stop doing the right things. Just means you learn when to speak and when to let your story do the talking for you." She handed him the flashlight. "Power went out here last week, didn't it?" He nodded. "Third time this month." "Well then, let's make sure you can still read even when the world goes dark." JD took the flashlight, its yellow plastic smooth and cold in his hands. Cora sat beside him, flipping open the book with practiced ease. The pages smelled faintly of paper dust and something sweeter, maybe old pencil shavings. "Now," she said, "you read the first page. I'll help when you need it, but don't worry about getting everything right. That ain't the point." He frowned. "Then what's the point?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she let the question sit, then leaned in. "Words won't save you yet," she said softly, "but one day you'll save others with them." And so it began. Not with a chalkboard or a test, not with grammar drills or reading comprehension worksheets, but with stories and old grocery ads and cereal boxes brought from home. Cora would cut out coupons, circle words like nourish and restore, and ask JD to use them in sentences that meant something to him. Sometimes he'd make them silly. Marcus restored his energy with peanut butter. Sometimes he'd make them serious. My grandpa needs nourishment, even when we don't have meat. And Cora would smile and write each one down. Night after night, the world beyond their little kitchen table stayed loud and unfair. But in the soft pool of flashlight glow, JD was building something, a vocabulary, a voice, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of the promise he'd write years later on a page that would stay folded in his pocket for decades. The assignment was simple. Write about who you want to be when you grow up, the teacher had said, writing the prompt in neat cursive across the blackboard. One page, due Friday. Most of the kids in JD's second grade class grumbled. They wanted to be baseball players, astronauts, or movie stars, but not on paper. Writing it down made it too serious, too much like homework. JD didn't grumble. He'd been thinking about that question for weeks, even before the prompt. Maybe it started the night he heard his grandfather on the phone, arguing with the power company. Or maybe it was after he saw Marcus get shoved in the hallway and told to stop looking so poor. Either way, something in JD had started to form, a quiet resolve, a wish that could shape itself into words. So he sat down on Thursday night at the kitchen table. Cora was grading spelling quizzes across from him. His grandfather had already gone to bed. JD wrote slowly, tongue between his teeth, pencil smudging at the edges. He paused often, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he wanted to say it right. When he finished, the page was wrinkled and a little dirty from his palms, but he felt proud, not loud proud, just steady. The next morning he turned it in. 2 days later, the paper came back with a red circle at the top. F, grammar. The handwriting was still his, but now it sat below a mark that told him none of it had come out right. He didn't say anything. He just folded it twice and tucked it into the back of his notebook. Cora saw it later that week, poking out like it wanted to be found. She pulled it gently from the stack, unfolded it, and began to read. The lines were simple, but they were his. I want to be a lawyer to help people who don't get picked. I want to help people who don't win, who don't have mom and dads who talk at meetings. I want to be good with words so I can fight without hurting anyone. I want to stand next to people who are sad so they don't be alone. I want to tell people they are not trash. She didn't cry, but she sat still for a long time, just holding the paper. Later that night, JD found it sitting on the kitchen table again. No edits, no comments, just a single sticky note stuck to the top. You passed my class. He smiled and folded it again, carefully this time, and placed it in the top drawer of his dresser, beneath a pair of socks he never wore. Years passed. He moved homes, changed schools, lost friends, found new ones, lost again. But through it all, he kept the paper. It moved from drawer to drawer, box to box, eventually making its way into a beat-up leather wallet when he turned 18. By the time he joined the Marines, the edges were soft, the folds permanent. By the time he ran for Senate, the ink had begun to fade, but the words stayed. Now, when cameras rolled and microphones circled, he never mentioned it, never pulled it out for a speech. But sometimes, after a hearing or a vote or a night that felt like failure, he'd slip his hand into that inside pocket, press his fingers against the crease, and remember. He didn't become a lawyer, but he did stand beside people who felt alone, and he never stopped trying to be good with words, even the ones they failed him for. The studio was the same shape, but everything inside it felt different. Same network, same lighting grid, same wall of glowing panels and digital ticker tape. But now the air carried something heavier than current events or campaign sound bites. It carried expectation. The producers had tried to frame it as just another roundtable. Rebuilding trust, voices from both sides. They even added a third guest, a respected economist from Denver, to ease the temperature. But everyone in the control room, in the audience and watching from home, knew exactly why people were tuning in. J.D. Vance, Jasmine Crockett, the rematch. They hadn't shared a stage since the night she'd mocked his second-grade record, since the call from the Appalachian Hills cut through the noise and made the country sit up straighter, since millions heard the voice of an elderly tutor who didn't speak like a pundit, but left a stronger mark than most politicians did in their entire careers. J.D. entered quietly, not late, but not eager. No entourage, no papers in hand, just the same dark gray suit and a faint crease in his brow. Crockett arrived moments later, heels clicking, smile poised. She was practiced, confident, and unapologetically composed. They shook hands before sitting, cordial if not warm. The tension was there, but muted now, like a coiled wire waiting for a spark. The host opened carefully. "Well, thank you both for joining us again. Last time you shared a stage, the moment, captured the nation's attention. Congressman Vance, if I may, I want to start by revisiting that exchange, specifically the remark about second grade. You didn't respond directly that night. Would you care to now?" J.D. didn't flinch. He didn't shift in his chair or glance off camera. He leaned slightly forward. The room held its breath. "Sure," he said calmly. "I think enough time has passed." He looked at Crockett, not with bitterness, but with something quieter, something more complicated. "When that comment was made, I didn't answer because I didn't feel like I had to. Sometimes silence is a defense, but I've been thinking about it since. About what it means when someone brings up your past to discredit your present." He paused, scanning the audience. Some nodded, some just stared. "I didn't pass second grade. That's true, I was held back. I struggled. But not because I didn't want to learn. I struggled because my grandfather was dying, my mother was gone half the time, and I was trying to keep a house from falling apart around me before I was old enough to ride the school bus alone." The room grew still. J.D.'s voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Cora Mae Dunley, the woman who called in, she didn't defend me because I was a victim. She spoke up because she knew the difference between failure and survival. And so do millions of people in this country who have never been graded fairly. Not on paper, not in life." Jasmine Crockett shifted, folding her hands. She didn't interrupt. J.D. continued. "You asked me to respond to the second grade remark. But I'll tell you this. The most important test I ever took wasn't in a classroom. It was whether I could make it through a childhood that no one in power ever thought was worth protecting." He leaned back, voice softer now. "And I passed." The host didn't jump in. She waited. Crockett met J.D.'s eyes across the table. Something in her expression had changed. Not an apology, not yet, but the edge had dulled. Her gaze held less armor than before. The conversation moved forward, to budgets, bills, bipartisan efforts, but everyone knew the real moment had already happened. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was a reckoning wrapped in restraint, and this time J.D. didn't let someone else speak for him. He had learned how to use his own words. The panel continued. Talking points resumed, but something had shifted. There was a pause between replies now, a softness in the tone. Even the host, usually quick to interject with questions, seemed to tread more carefully. Jasmine Crockett answered policy questions with poise, but her gaze drifted. Once or twice she glanced at J.D., not as a rival, but as someone trying to reconcile the man across the table with the boy they'd all heard about. And then, near the end of the segment, the host turned to J.D. one last time. "Senator Vance," she said, "you mentioned surviving a system that didn't test what really mattered. If you had the chance to go back and tell that boy something now, what would you say?" J.D. didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached inside his jacket pocket, fingers moving slowly, deliberately, like someone retrieving something fragile. He pulled out a small, folded square of paper, creases deep, edges yellowed. He held it up, just enough for the cameras to catch the blur of handwritten pencil marks on wide-ruled lines. "I wrote this when I had no shoes," he said quietly, "no friends and no praise. But I had a promise." The room stilled. J.D. unfolded the paper, his fingers tracing lines he knew by heart. "It was a writing assignment, second grade, the same year I failed. I didn't get the grammar right, didn't even get the spacing right, but I wrote what I meant." He cleared his throat. just once, then began to read. When I grow up, I want to be a lawyer to help people who don't get picked. I want to help people who don't have mom and dads who talk at meetings. I want to be good with words so I can fight without hurting anyone. I want to stand next to people who are sad so they don't be alone. I want to tell people they are not trash. He looked up. No one spoke. The panel, the host, even the crew behind the glass. Silence, thick and unmistakable. JD folded the paper once again, twice, and placed it gently back into his coat. I didn't become a lawyer, he said with a faint smile. Life had other plans, but I never stopped trying to be what that boy wanted to become. Not for the sake of politics, just for the sake of making sure someone else like him, someone who didn't get picked, knows they're not alone. The host blinked rapidly, struggling to recover. Jasmine Crockett exhaled. Her posture softened, not out of defeat, but understanding. This wasn't about winning a segment anymore. It was about something heavier than that. No one clapped. No one filled the air with commentary. They didn't need to, because in that moment, the story had outgrown the show. JD hadn't defended himself with facts or policy points. He had simply reached into his past, pulled out a memory written in pencil, and placed it gently in front of the country. And what remained was not applause, but stillness. Not because the story had ended, but because it had finally been heard. The studio waited. The cameras didn't cut. The host didn't rush in with a question. The lighting didn't shift, nor did the cue cards move forward. Everything, for a breathless moment, stood still in the quiet wake of JD's reading. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett sat with perfect posture, her hands neatly folded in her lap. Her eyes, though still focused on JD, no longer held the same gleam they had when she first took the stage weeks ago. There was no retort on her lips, no sharp line, just breath held back, somewhere between thought and hesitation. She opened her mouth once, slightly, but said nothing, and that in itself said everything. A single clap echoed from the front row of the studio audience. It wasn't enthusiastic, it wasn't performative. It was a slow, almost reverent sound. A woman, gray-haired, glasses slipping down her nose, pressing her palms together with the rhythm of someone who had seen enough to know when words no longer applied. Then another person joined in, then a third. The applause didn't roar. It rose quietly like a wave that wasn't trying to crash. Just touch the shore. JD didn't acknowledge it. He didn't rise or bow or smile. He simply let it be. I didn't pass their test, he said softly, almost beneath the applause, but I passed the one that mattered. And with that, he sat back, letting the final word belong not to the show, but to the silence that followed. The segment ended a few minutes later. The panel thanked each other. The host stumbled through a wrap-up about bipartisanship and empathy and reclaiming American discourse. But even her practiced delivery felt muted, dwarfed by the moment they had just witnessed. As the credits rolled, the crew began to unclip microphones. The audience began to stand, blinking as if they'd forgotten where they were. But the moment had already traveled far beyond the walls of the studio. In a modest living room in rural Illinois, a fourth-grade teacher named Sharon Polk sat cross-legged on the carpet, lesson plans spread around her, the remote still in her hand. She hadn't meant to watch the entire segment. She had papers to grade, dishes to wash, tomorrow's bulletin board to finish. But she couldn't look away. When JD had read that letter, she felt her throat tighten. Not because it was tragic, not because it was inspiring, but because it was familiar. She had a drawer full of essays just like it, smudged, misspelled, emotionally clumsy, but true. Essays from students who wrote about wishing their mom didn't cry at night, about wanting to be the man of the house, even though they were still afraid of the dark, about being angry, scared, hopeful, sometimes all in the same paragraph. She reached over, pulled open that drawer and ran her fingers over the stack of folded, messy dreams. Then she cried. Not loud, not long, just enough to feel the pressure leave her chest, and for a brief moment, she didn't feel like a teacher chasing standards or attendance sheets or board evaluations. She felt like someone who might have unknowingly kept a JD from quitting. All across the country, the reaction was similar. Quiet, reflective. Parents looked at their kids differently. Teachers reopened old notebooks. Veterans remembered the child they once were before uniforms and paperwork. And somewhere in Kentucky, Cora Mae Dunley sat beside her radio, hands folded, eyes closed, not smiling but listening. Because sometimes the most powerful sound isn't applause. It's the sound of no rebuttal. And in that silence, a nation had remembered something it had forgotten how to hear. It started with teachers, not policymakers, not influencers, not talking heads, just teachers, thousands of them, who saw a clip of J.D. Vance reading a faded childhood essay on national television and felt something stir that didn't fit into lesson plans or parent-teacher conferences. They began sharing stories. A retired educator from South Dakota posted on Facebook, "He reminded me of Caleb. Walked 5 miles to school in snow. Failed 2 grades before we realized he couldn't see the board. He's a paramedic now." A first-year teacher in Detroit wrote, "I've got 3 JDs in my class right now. No lunch, no backpack, no bedtime stories, but they show up anyway." The posts weren't meant to go viral, but something about their honesty, simple, unfiltered, and deeply human, caught fire. Hashtags began to emerge. Hashtag he didn't fail. Hashtag surviving his passing. Hashtag passed the real test, the last one stuck. By the end of the week, hashtag passed the real test had trended across multiple platforms. Parents shared photos of kids doing homework by flashlight. Former dropouts wrote about second chances, and teachers across the country began using JD's essay as a writing prompt. Who would you stand next to so they don't feel alone? But the most unexpected response came from a tiny school in eastern West Virginia. Pine Hollow Elementary had fewer than 200 students, 1 main hallway, a principal who also drove the morning bus route, and a literacy rate that had stubbornly lagged behind the state average for decades. On a snowy Monday morning, Principal Dana Leary wheeled a plastic bin into the cafeteria during breakfast. Inside were stacks of old cereal boxes, grocery flyers, coupon inserts, and highlighters. She stood in front of the students and said, "Starting today, we're launching something new, the Cereal Box Literacy Club. You don't need a library card. You don't even need to spell everything right. You just need to bring your eyes, your voice, and your story." A few students giggled. One raised a hand and asked if they still had to do spelling tests. Dana smiled. "Only if you want to." They spent the morning underlining words like fuel, strong, and believe. Some practiced writing sentences using those words. Others told stories about what it meant when their moms bought cereal with double coupons, or why Frosted Flakes always showed up when Grandma came to visit. By Friday, the entire hallway outside the cafeteria was covered in taped-up stories. Not perfect ones, not grammatically polished, but stories that were loud with feeling, thick with survival, and unmistakably alive. Word spread. A local news outlet picked up the story, then a national education blog, then a regional TV station with a segment called America's Heart. They asked Principal Leary why she started the program. She answered with a smile, "Because if J.D. Vance could learn to read from a cereal box, then maybe we've been underestimating what's sitting in front of us this whole time." Elsewhere, other schools followed suit. They called it different things: back-of-the-box readers, dinner table dialogues, grocery storytellers. But the heart was the same. Not every child has a bookshelf, but every child has a story. And now in homes and classrooms and shelters and community centers, those stories were being told. Not for a grade, not for applause, just for the simple power of saying, "I see you." Because what began as a memory, folded in a wallet, had become a movement. And for the first time in a long while, America wasn't just testing its students. It was learning from them. It didn't start with a press conference. There were no balloons, no big podium, no partisan flags waving behind him. It started, like so many things had for J.D. Vance, with a quiet conversation in a forgotten hallway. This time, in the basement level of the Capitol, just outside the Education Subcommittee hearing room. He stood there with a leather folder under one arm, worn at the edges, and a small printout clipped inside. A proposal to establish federal microgrants for rural literacy programs. The language was modest. No sweeping federal overhaul, no culture war lightning rods, Just a blueprint to send resources, books, basic supplies, reading aids, to communities like the one he'd grown up in. The ones that didn't make headlines unless a plant shut down or a mine collapsed. The towns where cereal boxes were sometimes the only reading material in the house. The bill was filed under the official title, Rural Early Literacy Development Expansion and Support Act. But everyone on the Hill started calling it something else. Bill 124B. At first, staffers assumed it was some policy code or amendment reference. But when a reporter finally asked JD during a walk-and-talk interview, he paused, smiled faintly, and said, "It was my second-grade classroom number." The clip aired that evening. A national anchor chuckled as she introduced it. You've heard of bills named after presidents, veterans, even acronyms. But this one? It's named after a room where a boy almost got left behind. In interviews that followed, JD didn't offer speeches. He told stories about the cracked linoleum tiles in room 124B, about the draft that came in through the window near his desk, about the afternoon he got sent home for handing someone a sandwich, about how a retired teacher started meeting him there after hours with old grocery ads and a flashlight, and gave him something the system hadn't. A second-grade classroom shouldn't feel like a final judgment, he said once during a subcommittee session, but for a lot of kids it does. This bill doesn't fix everything, but it widens the doorway, so more kids like me don't have to wait for a miracle. The bill didn't make front-page news. It didn't dominate cable cycles, but something about it stuck. Teachers posted pictures of the number 124B taped to their classroom doors in solidarity. Schools in coal towns and desert counties began naming their reading corners after it. A community center in Iowa held a ribbon cutting for its new after-school program and carved into the doorframe, "In memory of a room that couldn't hold him back." When the bill passed through the Senate with bipartisan support, JD gave a short statement. He didn't mention his past. He didn't invoke emotion. He just said, "Sometimes the smallest rooms in your life leave the biggest marks. This one did for me." In the back of the room, a congressional aide who had grown up in a foster home held back tears. She texted her sister later that night, "The guy who failed second grade just got a literacy bill passed. You'd have loved this." That week, the Library of Congress quietly received a new archival submission, a child's handwritten essay from 1992, folded in half, red marked at the top with a grade that no longer mattered. Attached was a note, "From the desk of Senator Vance. For the record, he passed." It had taken JD 3 tries to finish the letter. The first draft felt too formal, like a senator talking to a constituent. The second tried too hard to be poetic, but the third, and when the third was quiet, honest, just like she had been. He wrote it late at night in his office, the framed essay with the red F sitting nearby. Rain tapped softly against the window, the kind of night that reminded him of Ohio winters, the ones where his shoes leaked and Cora met him at her front steps with a towel and a mug of something warm. He addressed it carefully. Ms. Cora May Dunley, Hearthwood Senior Center Room 117. Inside the envelope, he tucked a freshly printed copy of Bill 124B, the legislation he had pushed through to fund literacy programs in rural schools. At the top, he wrote in pen, "This one's for you." Then came the letter, handwritten, no staffers, no edits, just his words. "Dear Miss Cora, you once told me words wouldn't save me yet, but one day I might save someone with them. You were right. That day came, and I carried you with me into every vote, every debate, every late-night doubt. This bill we passed, it wasn't about policy. It was about remembering who taught me to read the world when the world didn't care whether I could spell it. You passed the test too, the one no one graded." JD. He sealed the letter, but paused before placing it in the outgoing pile. Instead, he slipped it into his coat pocket. 2 days later, he flew back to Ohio, not for a press event, but for something quieter. He didn't go with cameras or aides, just himself, a driver, and a folded piece of paper. Cora didn't speak much anymore. The nurses said she had good days and quiet ones. That day was somewhere in between. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, and he took her hand. He read the letter out loud, slowly, deliberately. And when he finished, he placed the bill on her lap and whispered, "We did it." She didn't reply, but she smiled, just faintly. Then with the little strength she had, she lifted one finger and tapped the copy of the bill twice, as if to say, "Understood." He stayed a little longer, talking about nothing and everything. When he left, he paused at the door and looked back. There beside her bed, the paper rested on her blanket. And in that quiet room, surrounded by faded walls and old books, the words she once gave him had finally come home. The Senate office had no plaques, no campaign photos, no framed magazine covers. But if you walked in and looked to the right of the window, just behind a glass paperweight shaped like a dogwood blossom, you'd see it. A plain wooden frame, gently worn at the corners, holding a single sheet of paper. The paper was yellowed slightly, lined loosely, and at the top right corner, in bold red marker, it read, F. Grammar. Visitors, staffers, constituents, foreign dignitaries would sometimes glance at it, thinking it was a joke. Then they'd ask. JD always answered the same way. "That F gave me everything." Some would chuckle nervously. Others would nod slowly, waiting for him to explain. Sometimes he would. Other times he didn't need to. But for those who stayed long enough, he would tell the story. Not of the grade, but of what wasn't graded. He'd say, "I was 8. I wrote that essay sitting on a kitchen floor. My grandpa had just had a fall. I had no thesaurus, no clean shoes, no clue what a semicolon did, but I had something to say." The visitors often stayed quiet after that. Some would glance at the frame again, this time with more attention. One German delegate once said, "In my country, we frame diplomas. You frame failure?" JD smiled gently. "No," he replied. "I frame survival, and the woman who helped me turn it into strength." There were days he'd arrive before sunrise just to sit in the quiet, facing that paper, not for nostalgia, for direction. That framed F was not a weight. It was a compass. It was raining in Chillicothe that morning. Not a dramatic storm, just a soft, stubborn drizzle that clung to every coat and collar. There were no reporters, no entourage, no podium, just a simple white church with creaking pews and a front row filled with local teachers, neighbors, and a few kids she'd once taught, now middle-aged with children of their own. JD sat in the second pew, alone. He had turned down all press inquiries. This was not a public event. This was a promise kept. When the pastor finished, he nodded at JD, who stood slowly, walked to the front, and took out a folded paper. It wasn't a speech. It was a poem. She read when others passed me by. She saw the question in my eye. With cereal boxes, truth she drew. She taught me letters, then taught me you. The room was still. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a sealed copy of Bill 124B on top of her casket. "She didn't teach a senator," he said quietly. "She taught a kid who needed a voice." Then he stepped down, sat again, and didn't speak for the rest of the service. After the burial, he walked alone to her grave. The others had left. He stood for a long time, rain soaking into his cuffs, and whispered something no one could hear. Before he left, he pulled a ribbon from his pocket, a faded bookmark she'd once used, the edges torn from overuse. He tucked it beneath the bouquet of lilacs that lay atop her grave. It read, "The child you believe in becomes the adult who believes." He didn't look back as he walked away. The clip played quietly in the civics classroom at Franklin High School. It showed JD Vance seated alone, reading a worn piece of paper aloud. The students watched as his voice cracked slightly on the line. "I want to be a lawyer to help people who don't get picked." One student, sitting in the back with headphones looped around her neck, whispered, "Wait, he failed second grade?" The teacher, Ms. Lawrence, mid-40s, sharp-eyed but kind, paused the video. She smiled, turned to face the class, and nodded. "Yes," he did. Murmurs spread across the room. "But he's a senator now," another boy said, slightly confused. "Exactly," Ms. Lawrence replied. "And the question isn't, how did he get elected? The question is, what kind of test really mattered?" She walked to the board and wrote, "What's the test America gives, and what's the one it forgets to grade?" A hush fell. She gestured toward the screen. JD Vance failed grammar, but he passed hunger. He passed silence. He passed being told he didn't belong. The classroom sat still. No scrolling, no giggling. Grades matter, she continued. But don't ever forget, they're snapshots. They're not your whole story. A girl raised her hand. Did the teacher who helped him get any award? Ms. Lawrence walked to her desk, picked up a printed article, and handed it out. It was the obituary of Cora Mae Dunley. At the bottom was a line from JD's letter to her. You didn't just teach me to read, you taught me what to fight for. Ms. Lawrence's voice softened. Legacy isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper that echoes. She hit play again. On screen, JD looked up from the paper, folded it, and said his final words. I didn't pass their test, but I passed the one that mattered. As the bell rang, students filed out slowly, quieter than usual. A sticky note was later found on the corner of the whiteboard. It said, Dear Ms. L, thanks for seeing us the way Cora did. This story reminds us that failure on paper does not define the value of a life. JD's framed F wasn't a mark of shame. It was the beginning of a deeper understanding that survival, resilience, and kindness are tests too, though they don't appear on any report card. Cora Mae saw potential where others saw a statistic. Her quiet belief shaped a future leader, not by correcting grammar, but by standing beside a boy the system overlooked. It's a tribute to every unseen teacher, every child trying silently to keep up, and every moment that isn't scored but shapes who we become. What's the test you remember most? Not the one you took, but the one you lived through. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.